Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a Boeing 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. In today's video, let's talk a little bit about how to hand fly the Boeing 737 aircraft. Now, I'm not going to cover every single basic aspect of flying an airplane in this one, but I will more emphasize on the basics on how Boeing wants you to fly the 737 and on some good and proper techniques. Let's start with a little bit of a basic theory nonetheless. The 737 is not a fly-by-wire driven aeroplane, so the forces are still fully aerodynamic with the exception of the control column forces that are provided by the elevator field computer and that are of course influenced by the hydraulic system of the aeroplane. Now, what it does not have, however, is any kind of automatic correction for changes on the influence of the forces on the airplane. If we quickly head outside, then we are going to see that the engines on the 737NG are hanging rather low, and in fact they are hanging below the center of gravity of the airplane, which means that as we increase thrust we are going to experience a pitch up moment, and as we decrease thrust we are going to experience a pitch down moment. Now, those of you who have previously built their experience on the Airbus A320 will probably not be that familiar with it, but if we are going to change thrust, this will actually have an influence on our pitch as well. Now, that being said, we'll also look at the primary trim techniques on the airplane, and we will discuss a little bit of background of some of the real airplane's behaviors that at the moment are not visible inside Microsoft Flight Simulator. But for now, let's go ahead with some of the basic techniques of flying the airplane. Boeing recommends that even when you're hand flying the plane, you are still to set the appropriate MCP values. So as you can see right now, we are flying 220 knots at 3000 feet and on a heading of 090, and therefore we have set all of those on the MCP as well. Now, as we are going to go through a couple of the exercises here, I will probably leave the bugs untouched, but in real life, whenever you are making a course change, an altitude change or a speed change, you are supposed to move those bugs along, just like I would do in an ordinary flight in the simulation over here, outside of the scope of today's exercises. So with all of that said, let's finally start with the first one, that is mastering the elevator trim in the Boeing 737. From the video of how to fly manually with the flight director, we already know a couple of our pitch and power values, so I'm not going to explain those in detail right now. If you haven't watched that video yet, I can very much recommend you to do so now before starting off with this one. The link to it is going to be in the video description below, and if everything goes right, you should also see it up on the screen right now. So, we already have our basics here of around about 60% thrust, 55 in this case, and something between 2.5 and 5 degrees of pitch that usually gets you flying straight and level depending on the weight and speed. Now, the first thing that we'll have to be aware of when we are manually flying the 737 is going to be the influence of the change in thrust and the change in airspeed on our lift. So we'll of course have to trim those forces out, and let's have a look now into how we are doing it. So when I'm about to increase my thrusts to 90% in order to accelerate the airplane from the current 220 knots to around 300 knots, then we will immediately notice how the nose of the plane is actually going to come up. And we'll counter this always with a control column. So don't fly the airplane on the trim, but fly it with a control column, and then use your trim in order to neutralize the forces on your control column. In terms of the flight simulator, as we are all using joysticks and as there simply is no good force feedback available for Microsoft Flight Simulator, at least none that would be similar to the forces experienced in the real Boeing 737, we will have to kinda use our joystick in order to simulate that. So basically, when you are doing an elevator input in your joystick, you will do your input in order to stabilize the airplane, so to get the nose pointing where you want it to be. And then you're going to use your trim until you can slowly let go of the control column and return it back to the neutral position, with the airplane at the same moment maintaining its pitch attitude. So, in this exercise, as we are about to increase our speed from 220 to 300 knots, our aim is to maintain the altitude of 3000 feet. Let's go about it. So, increase my thrust 90%. Immediately the nose wants to rise, and you can see how I'm slowly adding forward pressure on the control column. And now I'm adding trim in order to reduce that pressure until my control column can return to the neutral position. As speed builds up, we have to add further downward pressure, and then use the trim in order to let go of the control column again. Approaching the target speed, 300 knots. Let's reduce our thrust, which means we'll need a bit of a pitch up input again. Trim that out. And here we are. Right, let's do the same the other way around. Thrust off. So basically you can see how every time I have to add a little bit of elevator up input here, I slowly thereafter add a little bit of trim so that I can return my control column to the neutral position, like now. Of course we are anticipating that in order to maintain our altitude we will have to increase or decrease the pitch appropriately. And approaching the target airspeed, let's set our thrust once again. So we're looking at about 55% here we set. And here we are. Alright. I recommend you do this a couple of times so that you actually get familiar with the way that the 737 responds to your inputs. Finally, something that I also notice at this very moment as we are changing our thrust. It might sound a little bit strange for flight simulator enthusiasts at first, because you may not be used to it. But in real life, every engine is a tiny bit different, and that even goes for FADEC-driven engines or EEC-driven engines like our 737. So with the thrust levers being more or less in the same position, you may not necessarily get the same thrust out of the engines. So always have a look at your engine indications over here and try to synchronize them so that you can get a more or less similar power output from both engines. Let's start off with the next exercise, that is going to be a turn to the left and to the right. Now, standard rate 1 turns, as they are required in IFR flying, can basically be done by taking a true airspeed divided by 10 plus 7. And that is going to give you your standard rate turn that you should follow when you are hand flying the aeroplane. Now, in our case, however, since we are flying a rather fast jet, I'm especially trying not to use the term fast jet because that would refer to military aircraft. But in our case, as we are flying a rather fast aeroplane, we have a true airspeed 220 right now, divided by 10 plus 7, giving us a bank angle of 28 degrees. And Basically, when we are flying faster than 180 knots, we are usually using a standard bank angle of 25 degrees. Now, as we are about to start our turn, we are going to lose a little bit of our lift vector, which is now no longer acting directly vertical onto the Earth, but which is now a little bit moved as we start to bank our airplane. That means we are going to lose a little bit of lift, and therefore we'll have to pitch up a little bit higher. Now, if you ask two pilots, you're going to get three opinions on whether you should trim those forces out in a turn or not. Here's my personal opinion on it, which undoubtedly will be challenged by a couple of real-life pilots. In my opinion, when you're doing a shallow turn, let's say we're flying 090 right now and we're about to turn to a heading of 060. That is a very short turn, not worth it trimming out the control column forces, in my opinion. But when we're doing a longer turn, then it might very well be worth to trim those out, because it makes it a little bit easier to focus on other things without having to constantly monitor the vertical speed of the aeroplane. But let's actually do this. So now we're going to change course from 090 to the new heading of 060. As I start the bank, I also have to pitch up a little bit to compensate for the decrease in lift. And approaching 060, we're going to roll the airplane out, once again, all of this very smoothly, and pitch it back down so that we can maintain our altitude. Now, let's make a right-hand turn by 180 degrees to a new heading of 240. This time, in my opinion, it is worth to trim the airplane out as we go along. So, let's make that right-hand turn. 25 degrees angle of bank. Now I'm adding a little bit of nose up trim here, so that I can actually return my control column to the neutral position, just like we've done on the previous exercise. Be aware that since the 737 is a stable aeroplane, it will try to roll back to a wings level situation very slowly, and so constant control column input will be required from the pilot in order to maintain the bank angle as we are banking along. The key to flying a stable turn is instrument scan, and the best instrument scanning technique that you can use is as follows. Pitch and power basically makes performance. So the pitch and the attitude indicator is the primary instrument that we are using all the time. The engine thrust is just equally important. However, since we are not changing engine thrust, it is not as important to check as often as is the pitch. So, the primary recommended scanning technique on the primary flight display is from the attitude indicator to the airspeed, back to the attitude, to the altitude and the vertical speed, and back to the attitude. And then also have a look at the navigation display and your engine instruments. There is a very good way to practice your instrument scanning technique, and that is by flying steep turns. Let's match the heading bug to 240 degrees as we're flying right now, and then we'll do some steep turn exercises. Oh, this is what I was looking for. And of course, while I'm playing around, I'm losing my altitude. In other words, my aeroplane has not been in trim, as I've just been saying all video long. But we'll go there. We'll get there. Alright, so let's do a couple of steep turns left and right in order to improve our scanning technique. When saying steep turns in airliners, we usually mean 45 degrees bank angle turns. So the bank angle warning can be expected, and we can also anticipate that we will need a significant pitch up moment, and we will need an increase in thrust in order to maintain our airspeed. So the target for this maneuver is to keep the speed at 220 knots and the altitude around 3,000 feet. Let's start with a 180-degree turn to the left using 45 degrees angle of bank. Basically, when I'm banking through 30 degrees, I will increase my thrust slightly in order to improve the maintenance of the airspeed. So let's go ahead and start with a maneuver. Starting the left-hand turn through 30 degrees, a little bit more pitch and more thrusts. And here we are. And now it's basically primarily scanning the attitude, since when the attitude is right, then we know that the remaining performance parameters will be about right as well. You can see speed is more or less steady around 220 knots, the altitude steady at 3,000 feet, bank 45 degrees, and the pitch is somewhere around 5-6 degrees. I'm finishing the turn, so pitch goes down, and I take a little bit of thrust off as well. 60%, tiny bit less, and here we go with a heading at 060. Well, let's make a right-hand turn. Again, 45 degrees angle of bank, back towards 240 degrees. This, by the way, is a standard exercise that you can expect in any pilot screening when a pilot applies with a new airline.
Bank angle, bank angle, bank angle.
And here we are, 45 degrees, around about 5 degrees pitch. A little bit turbulent here, making that exercise a bit more difficult.
Bank angle, bank angle.
And basically my eyes are now going always from the ADI to the speed, back to the ADI, then to the altitude, back to the ADI, to the heading, back to the ADI. Alright, let's finish that turn. And here we are back in the original condition. Gained a tiny bit of altitude, but the limit in any aviation exam is usually 150 foot of altitude. So do this exercise a couple of times until you are sure that you have mastered the instrument scan and until you're able to actually maintain your speed and your altitude in a steep turn, because steep turns are pretty much the one maneuver that requires the most, or that is the most demanding for a pilot in terms of the instrument scanning technique. Next up, let's talk about the handling of the aeroplane as we extend the landing gear and the flaps. Now, we all know that Airbus says that their airplanes would not balloon. And we all know what happens when we extend flaps 2 in the Airbus, right? But the 737 is also ballooning. Let's go ahead right now. We're at 220 knots. Let's extend flaps 1. And you will see that we will have to apply a corrective action on the control column initially and thereafter on the aeroplane's pitch trim in order to maintain our level flight. So, flaps 1. I'm not doing any input right now so that we can see how the aeroplane is behaving. You can see as the leading edge devices are moving there, we are gaining a lot of additional lift, which is pulling our nose up. So some forward elevator input is needed, and then we'll have to trim that one out. Thereafter, a little bit more thrust, of course, is also needed due to the additional drag. Let's go ahead and extend flaps 5. The leading edge devices are staying exactly where they are, but we are getting some additional drag from the flaps extending, and once again we'll have to trim the airplane out in the very position where we want it to be, maintaining our altitude. Once again, there is a huge difference in between the short field performance aircraft and the non-short field performance aircraft in the use of flaps 10. So when you are about to extend flaps 10 in a short field performance aircraft, you will basically not feel any difference. But if you do so in an aircraft that does not have the short field performance kit installed, you're going to notice a lot of additional drag that is going to be added to your flight. Now let's quickly check what we have in this very aeroplane here. And we can see we don't have the short field package in this aeroplane installed. So let's reduce our speed to around 200 knots, and then I'm going to show you the difference of extending the flaps to 10 in the non-short field performance aircraft. Alright, the plane is trimmed out. Let's go flaps 10. Flaps are coming out, leading edge devices are moving. Now we're here at flaps 10. You can see how the speed is immediately trying to decrease. And that is quite a considerable amount of drag. If you do the same exercise in an aircraft that does not have the short field performance kit fitted, you will hardly notice a difference except for the requirement to add a little bit of trim in order to keep your nose pointing where it is supposed to be. Now let's come to the next factor that is going to need a lot of retrimming of the aeroplane. I'm going to reduce my speed a little bit further here. Let's go down to 165 knots. And then we'll take the gear down and the flaps to the 15 position. Note once again, as I'm changing airspeed, I am anticipating that I will need a little bit of back pressure on the control column here, and that I am going to trim that out as we are going along. Alright, here we are at flaps 10, 165 knots. So let's go gear down and flap 15 now, and do notice the difference in the requirement to trim for the aeroplane to stay level. Alright, gear down, flap 15. You can see immediately the nose of the airplane tries to drop. That is because, of course, with the landing gear extending, we are moving our center of gravity downwards, and that does have quite a significant input. So do anticipate that, and do anticipate that you will have to apply corrective trim when you are about to extend the landing gear. Finally, let's go to a landing flap setting of flap 30. And once again, notice the requirement to trim the aeroplane as the flaps are coming down. Alright, so here we are in the landing configuration. In all of these conditions, anticipate as well that you will have to add a little bit of thrust. Like you can see now in landing configuration, in order to maintain 150 knots, we need something around 70 and a bit percent N1, while in clean configuration it used to be just about 55%. Now let's go ahead and retract the flaps and retract the landing gear again. Flaps 15, gear up. Flap 5. Flaps 1. And flaps up. Alright, trying to move a little bit away from the hills over there, because they are having an influence on our turbulence model at the moment. Let's talk about one more maneuver, and that is the actual handling of wind gusts and turbulence. Now, all of you know that we are adding a corrective amount of airspeed for our wind factor. So, adding half the steady wind plus a full gust to a maximum of VRF plus 15. However, you're not going to be able to keep the speed exactly where it is just by adjusting the wind. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of gusts in. Thank you very much. Let's increase our wind over here, 25 knots, and take a gust at, give me 37 knots. I'll turn the plane right into the wind so that we can see the effect on the airspeed indicator a little bit better. And over here, the pitch and power flying really becomes important, because when you're doing an approach with the wind straight down your nose and with so many gusts, it will be very hard for you to actually maintain the airspeed at the exact speed where you want it to be. And that's why it will become very important to use the pitch power values. So I've turned the airplane right into the wind here, 270 degrees. Let's set the heading block as well. Now you can see how the airspeed is just jumping around on the speed tape. And that is unfortunately pretty realistic. The very same would happen in a real Boeing 737. So, how do we maintain the speed on final approach then? The honest answer to that is, we cannot maintain the speed precisely on final approach. What we usually try to do is to keep the speed anywhere between the speed buck and the actual VRAF. So, trying to keep the speed around 200 knots right now. It will not be possible to keep it exactly at 200 knots, but if we set our standard pitch power value for flaps up right now, and the same works in landing configuration, just to make that clear from the very beginning. So we know that we'll need something around 6 degrees of pitch, and we'll need an N1 that is going to be in the region around 55 to 60%. So if I just set those values, then my speed is going to vary a little bit, but it is going to vary around the target of 200 knots right now. And then only minimal input from my side are required in order to keep the speed round about where I want it to be. This, however, does have one influence on the airplane, and that is the aeroplane's pitch. Now, with the speed varying to such a great degree, it will be a little bit harder to maintain an accurate rate of descent on a glide slope while the speed is varying. So when your speed all of a sudden increases by 20 knots, you will be required to pitch down a little bit more, and when the speed all of a sudden reduces, you will be required to pitch up a little bit more. And we can see this on a certain scale over here, that the different lifts that we are going to have does have quite an effect on maintaining our altitude. You can see here we are, our speed is more or less stable around the 200 knots that we are looking for. Of course varying up and down, but as said, that is totally normal and expected. Alright, this shall be it for today's video. I hope that you learned a little bit about the basics of flying the aeroplane by hand and flying the aeroplane without the flight director. There will probably be some future videos about how to fly an approach in conditions like this, and some videos on where I'm going to show you how to manage these wind gusts in total. Overall, for now, thank you very much for watching, and I hope that you have enjoyed this one, and I am looking forward to welcome you again on a future video. For now, if you want to support the channel, you can do so through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or through the Patreon link if you plan on becoming a permanent supporter. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again soon.